Take a second right now. Seriously, just pause. If I handed you a blank piece of paper and asked you to complete the sentence, I am, well, how would you finish it? Like, how easy would that actually be? And how long would it take you? This simple little prompt is actually used all the time in psychology to kickstart an incredibly personal journey of self-discovery. Because when you try to fill in that blank, you're actively describing yourself. But what exactly does that even mean? Well, welcome to this explainer on Chapter 2, Self and Personality. I'm absolutely thrilled to have you here because today we're going on a fascinating exploration into the characteristic ways we define our very existence. We're going to unpack the architecture of who you are, pulling directly from our source text on self and personality. We'll be breaking down some deeply complex psychological theories into clear, actionable insights. So here's our roadmap for today. 1. Defining self and personality. 2. Unpacking personality traits. 3. Freud and the unconscious. 4. Behavior and cultural influences. And finally, 5. Measuring who we are. All right, let's dive right into Section 1, Defining Self and Personality. You know, it's pretty fascinating to realize that a newborn baby actually has absolutely no concept of a self. It's totally a blank slate. The self doesn't just magically appear out of thin air. It emerges and forms incredibly fast as the child grows up. It's shaped heavily by interactions with parents, friends, teachers, the whole shebang. Our experiences and, crucially, the meaning we assign to them essentially serve as the building blocks of our self. And as we grow, we start to see ourselves in kind of a dual nature. Psychologists point out that when people describe themselves, they tend to use a very clean binary. They either describe the self as subject, meaning the self as an entity that actively does something, like saying, I am a dancer, or they describe the self as object. That's an entity upon which something is done, like saying, I easily get hurt. It's basically the fundamental difference between seeing yourself as the active doer versus the one. Now, as we shift from self to personality, we kind of run into a bit of a vocabulary traffic jam. People constantly throw around words like temperament, trait, disposition, character, habit, and values as if they all mean the exact same thing. But in psychology, precision matters. For instance, temperament is a biologically based way of reacting, while a habit is an overlearned mode of behaving. So the crucial point here is that personality really stands apart from these terms. Personality is actually defined as our relatively stable pattern of behavior across various situations. It's that consistent thread that makes you, well, you. Moving right along to Section 2, Unpacking Personality Traits. Have you ever noticed how two kids raised in the exact same family by the exact same parents can develop completely different ways of reacting to the world? Like, one might be a total thrill seeker while the other just loves quiet reading. Why is that? Well, let's look at how Gordon Allport's trait approach answers this. Allport actually went through the English dictionary, literally analyzing the words people use to describe themselves to categorize human traits, and he came up with a hierarchy. At the very top, you have cardinal traits. These are highly generalized dispositions that essentially define a person's entire life. Then, you have central traits, which are a bit less pervasive but still really characteristic of the person. And finally, secondary traits, which are much more specific and less consistent. Allport believed these persistent traits act like a sort of internal operating system, integrating all the crazy stimuli we face into consistent, predictable responses. Okay, Section 3, Freud and the unconscious. Now, we're going to slow things down just a bit to dive into a much heavier, slightly more mysterious realm of psychology, the psychodynamic approach. This perspective owes its existence largely to the physician Sigmund Freud. Now, unlike researchers who relied on surveys or flipping through dictionary words, Freud developed his theory entirely during his clinical medical practice. Freud visualized the human mind like a giant iceberg split into 3 distinct levels of consciousness. First up is the conscious level. This includes the thoughts and feelings you are actively aware of right in this exact moment. Just below the surface is the preconscious, which holds mental activity you can become aware of if you just focus your attention on it. But the vast majority of the mind, that massive hidden underwater chunk of the iceberg, is the unconscious. This holds mental activity we are completely 100% unaware of. Actually, early in his career, Freud used hypnosis and dream analysis just to figure out how to access and decode that deeply buried third level. And inside that unconscious mind, Freud proposed there are 3 primary structural elements constantly battling for control: the id, the ego, and the superego. Our source text uses a really great analogy to illustrate this daily internal conflict. So imagine a little boy who wants an ice cream cone. His id, which operates purely on the pleasure principle, screams at him to just grab the cone right out of the vendor's hand and eat it immediately. It wants instant gratification, right now.
The superego, which is basically the moral branch that internalizes parental and societal rules, questions the ethics of stealing and feels terribly guilty. Finally, the ego, which operates on the reality principle, steps in to mediate the situation. The ego patiently figures out that the most realistic way to get the ice cream without getting in trouble is to just simply ask for permission or pay for it.
That brings us to Section 4, Behavior and Cultural Influences.
So Freud's theories obviously focus heavily on biological internal conflicts, but modern psychology recognizes that, hey, we don't exist in a vacuum. Let's look at how the outside world shapes our character. The post-Freudian theorist Erich Fromm took a very different path here. He argued that we absolutely cannot be understood just by looking at our internal biology. He viewed human beings basically as social beings first and foremost. Fromm proposed that our character traits develop directly from our social experiences and our relationships with other people. He believed that our psychological growth is actually driven by higher-level desires, like a striving for freedom, justice, and truth, which are shaped heavily by the culture we live in.
Taking that focus on the external world even further, we have the behavioral approach. Behaviorists completely strip away all that mysterious concept of the unconscious we just talked about. To them, personality is incredibly straightforward. It's simply our learned responses to our environment. They look at our stimuli, our responses, and reinforcement. The core tendency that organizes our behavior, according to this view, is really just the reduction of biological or social needs. Basically, if a specific behavior successfully reduces a need and gets reinforced, bam, it becomes part of our personality.
And finally, Section 5, Measuring Who We Are. So, we've looked at traits, the unconscious mind, and environmental conditioning. But how do psychologists take all these competing theories and actually capture hard data? Well, the text outlines a few different assessment techniques. You have self-report measures, which are structured tests where you answer questions directly about yourself. Then there are projective techniques, which try to bypass the conscious mind to uncover those hidden unconscious motives. Very Freudian, right? And finally, there is behavioral analysis, where psychologists simply observe how a person acts in real time. But there is a super fascinating caveat here from the source material. In behavioral analysis, the mere presence of an observer can actually contaminate the results. Because the subject knows a stranger is watching them, their behavior naturally changes, meaning the psychologist might not even be getting accurate data in the first place. Wow, we've covered some incredible ground today, moving all the way from the moment a newborn starts to form an identity, through Allport's dictionary diving and Freud's mental icebergs, right down to the actual challenges of just observing human behavior. We are immensely complex creatures, constantly balancing deep unconscious desires with the social rules of the world around us. So I want to leave you with a little thought to apply to your own life today. The very next time you find yourself making a tough decision or resisting a sudden urge, just pause for a second and ask yourself, is it your patient, realistic ego taking the wheel, or is your demanding, pleasure-seeking id driving the bus? Thank you so much for learning with me today. Keep asking questions and keep exploring.